Today we're looking at a series of political revolutions that are going to sweep through the United States, France, and many other parts of Europe during the modern era. So we're going to start by looking at the causes for these revolutionary ideas. And by far the biggest cause of these revolutionary ideas was Enlightenment principles. The ideas of the Enlightenment begin to spread not just through Europe, but also to the United States, later to parts of Latin America as well. And these ideas of the Enlightenment are going to inspire people to push for greater freedom. And it's going to encourage things like personal freedoms and the idea that people should have a role in government, ideas of popular sovereignty, that people are the source of a government's power. And so one of the most influential philosophers of the Enlightenment that's really going to inspire a lot of these Enlightenment ideals was John Locke. John Locke principled the idea of natural rights, that all people are born with natural rights, and when a government fails to protect those natural rights, that it's justified to replace that government with a new one that would protect people's freedoms. And so Enlightenment ideas are going to really be the underlying cause of most of these revolutions. Some other things that played a role: commercial expansion. We looked at this with the age of European exploration. And as we see a growth in capitalism, that's going to lead to a new wealthy class that now wanted power that used to be reserved just for the upper landowning aristocracy. And then also population growth. As the population continued to explode throughout Europe, that's going to cause these growing populations, especially the lower and middle classes, to begin to seek change and begin to seek more freedom and equality. So we're going to start with the American Revolution. And to understand the causes of the American Revolution, we really have to go back to the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. After the 7 Years' War, Britain was in quite a bit of debt. And so they felt that the colonists should help pay for some of that debt, since a lot of it was fought in North America. Furthermore, it cost Britain a lot of money to keep an army and keep a government presence over in the colonies. And so they felt that the colonists should help pay for some of that debt. And so it's this debt after the 7 Years' War that leads to Britain beginning to tighten their control over the colonies and began to raise taxes on the colonists. And you have to remember, the colonists were always used to quite a bit of local autonomy and kind of a loose control by Britain. They were used to having their own local assemblies. And so as Britain tightened their control over the colonies, it really didn't go over very well. So they start by passing taxes, simple taxes like a sugar tax and a stamp tax. And the colonists are going to respond by boycotting British goods. And we kind of have this cycle where Britain passes a tax, the colonies boycott British goods. Eventually that starts to kind of hurt Britain's economy, and they decide to repeal that tax, and later they'll pass a new tax. And so we have this cycle that takes place of passing these taxes, boycotts, and then repealing these taxes. Also, Britain begins to tighten their overall control over the colonies. One thing that the colonists were especially upset with was the Proclamation of 1763 that forbid them to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, as the population continued to grow in the colonies and more of these free peoples wanted available land, they wanted to expand westward. But Britain really didn't know what to do with the Native Americans and didn't want to have growing issues over conflict between colonists and natives. And so they passed that proclamation until they could kind of figure out what to do. And so all of the growing taxes and this resentment leads to growing tensions between Britain and the colonies. And all of this is eventually going to culminate in the beginnings of the American Revolution. And so the first battle of the American Revolution was the Battle of Lexington and Concord. As British troops were traveling to Concord to seize some ammunition and weapons there, they are stopped by a group of militiamen from the colonies. And at Lexington, it was basically a massacre. They fire on the militia, and the militia very quickly breaks up. But at Concord, they face a much larger militia that ultimately holds their own and forces the British to retreat. And so this is the beginnings of the American Revolution. And the colonists are going to, at the Second Continental Congress, pass the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence does exactly what it says. It declared that the colonies were now free of British rule, and it told the reasons why. And Thomas Jefferson drafted it, and it's based on the basic principles of John Locke. It said that Britain basically was not protecting the colonists' natural rights, or as Jefferson said, their unalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. And because of that, the colonies were breaking free of British rule. And so the Declaration of Independence becomes kind of that unifying force in the American Revolution. And when you look at the strengths of both sides in the American Revolution, Britain had most of the advantages. They were one of the dominant global powers at this time period. They had a dominant army, they had a dominant navy, they had a strong government, they even had supporters in the colonies. Really, the only advantages the colonists had was superior leadership, especially that of George Washington, and European allies, especially France. The colonists would not have won the American Revolution without France's help. Once France saw that the colonies actually had a chance after that Battle of Saratoga, France is going to provide most of the ammunition for the colonists. They're going to provide about half of the troops from that point on. Almost all of the Navy support came from France. And basically, France saw this as a way to kind of embarrass one of their major rivals and enemies back in Europe. And so ultimately, with help from France, the colonists win independence. And with that, they have to create a new government. And so the new government that they create after the failed Articles of Confederation would be the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution was based on, again, these Enlightenment principles. Especially those of Baron de Montesquieu. His ideas of separation of powers and checks and balances form the foundations of our Constitution. And so what the Constitution creates is a republic with three different branches of government, separation of powers, each with their own responsibilities. And then in order to keep any one branch from becoming too powerful, they implemented a system of checks and balances to where each branch kind of has a check over the other to keep it from dominating. And so again, our Constitution is based on these Enlightenment principles. And then they also included later in the Bill of Rights, all of our individual freedoms like freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and many others.